Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm very excited about this conversation. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Sharon Salzberg, known to meditators everywhere as a renowned meditation teacher. Also as co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society, which is a truly important institution in American Buddhism. Don't get that humble look on your face. It is.
I'm sitting there right now. I'm in IMS.
You're at IMS right now in Barre, Massachusetts. But really, in terms of bringing Vipassana meditation and the very closely related mindfulness meditation into America, I think one probably could not name a more important institution than the Insight Meditation Society. And you and Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein founded it these many years ago in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And I've been there. I've done retreats. I'm on the path.
You certainly are.
But we're not here to talk about me, happily. Everyone will be happy to hear. We're here to talk about your new book, Real Love, The Art of Mindful Connection. Now, I've been reading the PDF because as we tape this, it's not quite out yet. So all I can hold is the cover page, a printout of the cover page. If you have an actual book, you can feel free to hold it. If you want to engage in self-promotion, or as we say in Buddhism, not self-promotion.
Yes.
As we say.
Here's some not self-promotion.
Yeah.
It's a very pretty cover.
It is a pretty cover. Now, that's looking like an orange from here. Is that about right?
It's orange, yeah.
Yeah, it's very pretty.
Yes, thank you.
And nice interior design, too. Very nice font. Now, since I started reading it, I have been unable to get that John Lennon song out of my head. Did you have that in mind, the song Real Love?
No, actually, I had previous books like Real Happiness and Real Happiness at Work, and I think that's really where the publisher was. Even though it's a different publisher, I think they thought, oh well, let's just do that.
Yeah. Well, it's a good song, so it's all. It's a feature, not a bug, that readers will be humming it.
That's great.
So let's see. Where should we start? Maybe we should start with the ambiguity and breadth of the word love in English. I mean, you note in the book that in some languages there are more words for describing the different kinds of love, but in English we have this one word that applies to a lot of different things, right? So how does that complicate the landscape? Well,
I think that the landscape is complicated because we tend to be kind of fixated on romantic love, that if somebody says love, that's what one thinks. And in fact, somebody in the publishing industry early on in my process with this book said, the love market is saturated. Like, don't write a book on love. There are already too many. And I thought, well, the relationship market may be saturated, like how to get a relationship, how to fix a relationship. But I don't know that the love market is saturated. And, it's been sort of an issue. Like, not only do we have those complications of various meanings, I think we actually live in a time where there's a kind of degradation of the notion of love, where it seems to imply for many people a kind of weakness or sentimentality, or you're going to be kind of complacent, compliant because of this state of love. And I don't think of it that way at all. I think of it as a force or power.
Okay. And as for these different... I mean, are these things so different that you kind of... I mean, I guess my question is this book kind of like a Swiss Army knife? Like there are a lot of different little tools for the different kinds of love? I mean, everything from love of a romantic partner to love of offspring to love of people we don't even normally think of ourselves as being inclined to love.
Yeah, I like that, the Swiss Army knife. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's... I'm calling love a state of profound connection. So the trajectory of the book is not through all those various different kinds of manifestations, but starting with ourselves, having a much deeper sense of connection to ourselves, and then love for an other, whether that's a partner or a child or a parent. Or I did a lot of kind of crowdsourcing with this book. I asked people for their stories, for their experiences, and the first time I met with a group in New York City, this man raised his hands and he said, we think a good relationship is 50-50. My dog and I, we're 100-100. So I thought, okay, so that's in the book. And then the whole third section of the book is love for all beings, like love for life itself. And it's a trajectory, although it's not completely linear either, it's kind of circular. So in that second section, love for another, it does sort of take away love from a strictly romantic context, although it does have a lot of stories about partners, because that's what people were really sending in.
So before we get into different kinds of love, the word mindful is in the subtitle, and although I'm sure a lot of people have an idea of what we mean by that, can you tell us what you mean, and particularly what you mean by it in the context of this book?
Mindfulness, of course, mindfulness is the buzzword, and these days. Mindfulness in the classical sense means a quality of awareness so that our perception of what's happening in the present moment is not so distorted by old fears, old habits, projection into the future, whatever it might be. And I think it's particularly in this context, mindfulness plays a crucial role in helping us see our own assumptions about ourselves and about others, and kind of look at those assumptions in the light and decide, is that worthy? Because some are, and some are really old patterns that are just holding us back. And so one whole set, for example, has to do with what is commonly called the inner critic, especially if it's a prevalent voice that is not just offering correct assessment. Like I did an event the other day, like a celebration of a particular meditation group, and before I was going to speak, there were 5 different singers from the Metropolitan Opera singing. And I sat there and thought, never going to happen for me. I will never, ever, ever be able to sing like that. That's a correct assessment. But the other sort of demeaning voice, the self-denigrating voice, which is just, it's like an add-on, it's just something that is so old and not connected to the truth of the moment, that we can see for what it is and learn to let go of it. And that leaves room for a state of true connection or love.
Okay, right. And so as you said, you do kind of start out with the issue of loving yourself. And I gather, you say, I think, that's connected to the loving of others. And is it your view that it tends to work more in that direction than the other? In other words, the inability to love yourself is more often an obstacle to loving others than it is kind of the other way around, if that makes any sense.
It does. I think some people actually do it the other way around. It's not very popular these days. Sort of the popular thing to say is you have to love yourself before you can love others. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, or even worse, or even more intense, people say you have to completely love yourself before you can love others. And that I don't think is true. I think there are many people who love others and care for others, and their professional lives are dedicated to that. Their personal lives are full of that. I don't think it's sustainable. Mm-hmm. Another way of describing love is a state of generosity. It's generosity of our energy, of our attention, of our care. And I think when there's not that basis of a sense of love for oneself, generosity gets distorted. It becomes something else. It's more kind of martyrdom, and then there's resentment, and there are other things that happen. So somewhere along the line, we have to figure, we have to be there. We have to be included.
Mm-hmm. And, as I said, I've been to a number of meditation retreats and, read various books by meditation teachers. This is a big theme, it seems to me. Like loving yourself and kind of not beating up on yourself, not being too hard on yourself. Do you think, we live in an age when there is a true epidemic of self-loathing? Or is it just that the kinds of people who have that as a problem have been drawn into this community of kind of mindfulness meditation?
That's a very interesting question. I think probably some of each. But I think it's also a question of... I think we have the tools now to understand things like performance, what actually enhances performance, the nature of self-compassion. Is it really laziness, or is it more like resilience? That we can assess and evaluate these things. We understand stress more. And what I'm told anyway is that research shows that a kind of high stress environment will enhance our performance briefly, and then we crash. And here too, to make sustained change in our lives, or to get something done or learn something new, we need some other factor, which is more about resilience. We need to bounce back from mistakes. We need to be able to fall down but come up again. And that has a lot to do with self-compassion. And so I think that there's a lot for anybody to learn, even if you don't kind of, become part of this community and practice meditation, just about beginning again and having resilience. And I do think self-compassion plays a role in that.
Mm-hmm. Of course, when you're just starting to try to meditate, it's easy to get mad at yourself for failing to focus, right? Because you're supposed to start by focusing, and so maybe that's a little bit of it. The first couple of days of retreat, that kind of self-criticism can be an obstacle. So as we said, there's kind of a spectrum. I mean, there's loving yourself, loving others, and, in the book you carry it all the way out to basically loving everyone, not just the people we ordinarily think of as likely targets of love. Now, there's a kind of meditation, loving kindness meditation, that very much follows that path, right? This is not like garden variety mindfulness meditation. This is a particular kind of meditation that you might encounter on a meditation retreat. Do you want to describe how you've written a whole book about that too, which has loving kindness in its title, I think. But for people who aren't familiar with it, do you want to kind of lay that out?
Sure. I mean, sometimes we say mindfulness meditation gives us the ability to see the difference between what's our actual experience and the story we begin to tell about it. And that way we have the power to choose. Some stories are very useful and bring us together and move us on. Some are really very old destructive narratives. Whereas loving kindness meditation will change our default story. So if we've largely, for example, been motivated by fear in what we do or what we say or what we hold back from doing or saying, over time we will largely be motivated by a sense of connection. Our worldview shifts, our sense of belonging shifts, our understanding and appreciation of interconnection shifts, so that we're just coming from a different place. And we practice it by paying attention differently. So if, for example, with yourself, you're in the habit at the end of the day of evaluating yourself, and you pretty much only remember the things you got wrong and the mistakes you made. With loving kindness, you're wishing yourself well. So you're getting almost like a broader picture. It's not denying the problems or the issues, but it's almost like saying, that's not all that I am. There's a bigger picture. Or you think about a very telling example would be, who do we not look at? Who do we look through? Who becomes the other, not even by force of bias or prejudice, but just indifference. Often people who play a role in our lives, they're like functionaries in our mind. They're not people. And they're more like objects. And so it has big moral implications, because if you kick a table, it's very different than kicking a person. It has a lot of implications for empathy and for our sensibility of recognizing ourselves in someone else. And it has a lot of, obviously, implications for love, loving kindness. And so we're not trying to force a feeling in doing that meditation or pretend we're feeling something we're not, but we're trying to pay attention differently so that we're more completely aware, we're more inclusive, we're more caring.
And the way loving kindness meditation typically starts out, as we said, it starts out with the self, and the basic instruction is to kind of think kindly about yourself. Wish yourself happiness. Think of yourself as deserving of happiness, and so on, right? And then it moves through a spectrum, and I think there's some variation here, but the idea is that you would next think of someone other than yourself, some specific person whom it's pretty easy to love, right? And then you go on down the line. At some point, it might be somebody who's been a benefactor, who's kind of helped you out, and it's kind of easy to love them. And then it's somebody who you just feel kind of neutrally toward. Eventually, you get to actual enemies, right? And so that's the pattern. Now, I have to admit, I know there are people like me. That is to say, people for whom this doesn't come easily. I'm sure you've encountered people who are like, I'm a real loving kindness meditation guy, and people like me who say, I'm not sure I am. I don't know if I'm unconsciously resisting it. I mean, I think it may be that first part like loving yourself, I mean, it's like maybe I should start at the other end. But
Well, you could actually. A lot of people do
yeah.
start at the other end. Yeah.
But is this I mean, how many people take to this readily and report great results?
A lot of people are resistant to it and feel very suspicious of it, and I think this suspicion is warranted because it sounds so weird, and why just take something for granted? The question is, are you in an experimental mode or not? You know, do you want to make the experiment or not? If you don't, you certainly don't have to. You know, there's tremendous power of love and compassion that comes just from being mindful.
I agree very much. I mean, I have been in a retreat, and just after regular garden variety mindfulness meditation for days and days, just thought of my worst enemy in a charitable way, which, believe me, is not an everyday experience for me.
Yes, that's right.
And I have similar feelings about myself. So I think we should emphasize that regular mindfulness meditation probably has some payoff in this realm.
Yeah, no, I think it has tremendous payoff in this realm. And so, you don't have to do this other meditation. For sure, you don't have to do it. And if you want to experiment, it's kind of interesting, to specifically devote some time. Again, you have to really understand it. You're not trying to force a feeling or be hypocritical about anything. And you don't have to start with yourself. You can start with the other end. It's kind of creative, and it's almost playful sometimes as a practice. The texts say, first of all, if you're offering loving kindness to an enemy or a difficult person, you're not supposed to start with the most unthinkable person in your life, but somebody you have a little bit of annoyance with, and you slowly make your way over. Because we're also building an embodied understanding, what could it mean to have loving kindness for someone else and for yourself, or to have compassion for someone and realize, you know what, I so disagree with them, I'm just going to keep fighting, but not with hatred in my heart, perhaps, or not so much hatred in my heart. There are a lot of things we may not figure out analytically, but we experiment enough with being in a different perspective that we feel the difference. We can know the difference.
Mm-hmm. You could also start in the middle, somewhere between me and enemy, start with my dog. That would be an easy one. Yeah,
no, definitely. And many people do, really.
Start with their dogs.
Yeah. Or cats.
That's the easiest case. Because there's not the complexity that comes with an offspring, right? Although that's pretty easy compared to some other things. Anyway, so, I mean, when you talk about the importance of, of being able to love yourself, I mean, one thing that involves is, in a certain sense, making your self-conception less dependent on being loved by others in a way, right? Or getting anything in particular from others, right? Which is hard.
It's very hard, but not freeing, I mean, one of the ways the book evolved, the whole notion of writing this book evolved, was out of one line in a movie, Dan in Real Life, which is, maybe, 12, 13, 14 years old now as a movie, something like that. And the line is, love is not a feeling, it's an ability. Love is not a feeling, it's an ability. And of course, certainly love is a feeling, and it's what we yearn for, and it's what we want. But I was very struck by the line because it resembled an experience I had practicing meditation in Burma, practicing intensive loving kindness, where something just shifted inside of me, and I realized that up until that moment, I'd kind of thought about love as a commodity and in the hands of someone else. It was like a package, which could be delivered unto me, but could also be taken away from me. And it's like if the UPS person was standing at my doorstep and changed their mind and went the other way, there'd be no love in my life. Right. I would be bereft. Whereas if I thought of it as an ability within me, it's mine. And other people may certainly enhance it and enliven it and nourish it or threaten it, but it's within me. And the art of cultivating it, however we choose to cultivate it, leaves us very empowered. It's not we're not cut off, and we're not disdainful of others by any means, but that strange kind of need to be endlessly fulfilled from someone else that doesn't have to be there. Mm-hmm. And what if your dog's in a bad mood one day?
My dog's pretty consistently happy, affectionate toward me. Yeah, that's the great thing about dogs. Certainly compared to children, is it's always within your power to make a dog happy. and people aren't like that. But anyway, I digress. Okay, so now there's an issue. Okay, so there's a big concept in Buddhism called attachment, and it's not encouraged. In fact, it's considered one of the major mistakes people are inclined to make is to feel attached to things, feel a kind of clinging, kind of lust for them, whether it's a food or a person or whatever. And I was thinking, love as we commonly think of it often comes with attachment. Maybe different kinds depending on the kind of love, right? Depending on whether it's your romantic partner, your offspring, your parents, but that is a recurring issue, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, definitely. And of course, it depends on how you use the word attachment, which in current Western psychological theory, of course, is a very nice thing. You want secure attachment. You don't want distorted attachment or whatever it's called. But in Buddhist teaching, has many words. They're so exact about the use of the word, and it really means a kind of control. So, of course, we feel attached to our children. But when that becomes an effort to control, we know we're in trouble. Mm-hmm. There's something else going on. It's like I taught a class over Skype with a friend's yoga teacher training class in California. And I said in the Buddhist teaching, the example for equanimity, that state of balance where you're not holding on and you're also not pushing away. The example is often used of a child who's now an adult and the way the parent relates to them. Like there's love, there's cherishing, there's joy, there's delight, there's concern. But the parent realizes, I can't make this person's decisions for them. I can't choose their spouse. I can't choose their livelihood. There's a certain kind of letting go, not throwing away, but letting go of the effort to control. So I was saying that, and apparently all these people in the yoga class had a lot of young children, and everyone was clamoring to say, no, it's like that with young children too. Like you cannot determine the kind of person they are. Like you can't, try to mold them to your wishes. And so there's a lot of letting go in that kind of real love or true love, in allowing somebody to be who they are.
Mm-hmm. Now, but I assume, you can't expect people, like if they suffer something horrible, like the loss of a child.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, what the sadness signifies is that they had, in some sense, been attached to the child.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you're not prescribing anything that would render people impervious to the sadness or the grief, right?
No, that would be horrible. That would be quite a horrible path, and why? No, it's. I don't know that I would say that one is grieving a terrible loss so much because of attachment, and that the preferred state would be not to feel the grief. I don't think it's like that at all. But as an example, my teacher, who I actually dedicate the book to, this woman named Deepa Ma, or Deepa's mother, that's her nickname. She came into meditation practice as a Bengali woman living in Burma because of the death of two of her children and then her husband, who died very, very suddenly. He was in the civil service in Burma. That's why they were there, and wasn't feeling well one day, and he died by that night. And she had one daughter, Deepa, left to raise, but she was completely grief-stricken, and she went to bed. She developed a heart condition. She couldn't get out of bed, and the doctor came, and he said to her, "You're actually going to die of a broken heart unless you do something about your mind. You should learn how to meditate." And she did. She got up, she went to the meditation center, and people say when she came out, it's like, it's not that, she was disdainful of the grief or the sorrow, but somehow she had developed this enormous compassion for people. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just about her and her loss, but it was really like taking in the world and being there. And I saw her with many, many, many kinds of people. And she was always like present and caring. And sometimes you think, wow, I would look at her and I think, wow, if I went through what she went through, I don't know if I would care if somebody was comfortable, mm-hmm. But there wasn't that element to her at all. It's like she knew anybody's life could change on a dime. Mm-hmm. And that in some way we're all so vulnerable, even though our lives look very different. we're all so vulnerable to that, and we need to help one another and take care of one another. And she was my teacher.
Now, is she the one who, as you recount in the book, said to you, you should become a teacher because you've suffered so much?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this is when you're, what, you're like 20 or something?
I was 21.
Uh-huh. And so you had a hard childhood.
I'd had a very hard childhood. I went to India when I was 18. I was a junior in college at that point. And I went through the school program. I came back, finished school, went back to India. And in 1974, I went to see her in Calcutta because I was getting ready to come back to the States for what I was convinced was a very brief visit before I turned my life around and went back to India forever, for the rest of my life. And Joseph Goldstein had come back about 6 months before, and she said to me, when you go back, you'll be teaching with Joseph. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. I said, no, I won't. She said, yes, you will. I said, no, I won't. And then she said, you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach. And it was an amazing moment for me because I had a very difficult childhood with a lot of loss and a lot of trauma. And I'd never thought of it as like a credential for doing good, or something that could be of service to anybody until that moment. And then she said to me, you can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking you can't do it that's going to stop you, which I actually thought of the other night with the Metropolitan Opera singers. I thought, no, she was wrong. That I can't do. But, I left her room thinking, no, I won't. I'm not going to do that. But as life unfolded and, all these events transpired, she was right.
Mm-hmm. So had your suffering or your circumstance at that point led you to have kind of a particular problem with loving yourself?
I think yes. I think it led to problems loving anybody. In many ways, I was reparented by my teachers, and I was moved by their example. And so, I wouldn't say that I was completely cut off from loving myself because they loved me, and I loved them, and it was part of that tremendous period of growth and understanding. But I would say I was far from, where things evolved to as I continued to practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you in the book you talk about the importance of stories, and of course this is kind of a theme in certainly in modern Buddhism. The fact that we tell stories about ourselves, about other people, and these are things we're imposing on kind of like raw perception. They're not actually intrinsic features of reality, the narratives we have about ourselves and so on. And you talk about just experimenting with different narratives, and one of them was try retelling your story as a hero's journey where you survived hard times and failures to become a stronger and wiser person. And I thought, I could see my life like that. I mean, almost anybody actually could.
Yeah.
Of course, that's still just a story. But so is the point of the exercise? I mean, I guess I'd say is the idea to sell yourself a more uplifting narrative, or just to become aware that all narratives are in some sense just narratives.
Well, I think one of the gifts of mindfulness is to see that all narratives are just narratives. Mm-hmm. That would be really a role, for mindfulness, and you don't ever want to lose that perspective. But I think it's seeing the elasticity of stories and seeing that, especially if you have a kind of fixation or obsession with a kind of negative story, like like somebody said to me the other day. When do you think how hard do I have to practice? How long do I have to practice to be completely free of the fear of death? And I was sort of like, would 90% do? Does it have to be completely? And on what basis are you judging yourself? And are you calling yourself a coward because you have a flicker of fear, which is totally understandable? Or, many of our stories are quite unjust toward ourselves and toward others as well. And so, and not only do we have the stories we tell ourselves, we have the stories the world tells about us. Somebody questioned me about that the other day and said, I don't think the world tells us stories about us. People don't know us. How do they tell a story about us? And I said, everything tells a story about us. Architecture tells a story about us. Mm-hmm. If you are in a wheelchair and there's no ramp, to get to where you want to go, or at IMS, as depending on how recently you've been here. We built a ramp right in the front of the building, rather than people in wheelchairs having to go around the side and go in the back, especially in the snow. And I wouldn't say it's an architectural thing of beauty, nor would I say it's convenient, because if you have to be parked back beyond it, you have to drive out, and it's like protruding. But it's the right story. That's the correct story to tell people about belonging and who belongs there, and the dignity of a person and all of that. So all of these things feed us these kind of implications about ourselves.
Now, I just want to talk a little more about the issue of loving yourself before moving on more to other categories of people. In thinking about myself, I don't want to make this about myself. I think part of it with me is I'm just a generally critical person. I'm critical of non-user-friendly software. I'm critical of people who are not considerate. And I'm critical of myself. I don't, it's not self-loathing so much as loathing. That is,
loathing.
That is the problem. But there's this interesting story in your book where you had been doing loving kindness meditation. You didn't see any great results. And then you were suddenly, summoned to Boston because of some kind of tragedy or complication involving friends. And you drop some big, glass thing or something. It shatters. And what was your reaction? Something like, "You're a doofus, but I love you"?
You are really a klutz, but I love you. And that happened in the bathroom right behind me. I'm in the very room that I first lived in when we moved into IMS.
Oh, really? Are you on the second floor?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm picturing the bathroom. Yeah.
And now you can't get there from this room. Then you can get there from this room.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had been practicing loving kindness for a week, which, I didn't have a teacher, I didn't have a guide, but I knew the structure of basically how it was done, which is you repeat these certain phrases like, "May I be happy, may I be peaceful," or "May you be happy, may you be peaceful," as an act of gift giving, not begging or pleading, but really offering or gift giving. And I knew you started with yourself and you went through all these different categories. So we had a month of no programming here when we first moved into the building. So I thought, okay, I'll just offer loving kindness, even though I don't have a teacher. So I spent the first week offering loving kindness just to myself, and I felt absolutely nothing. It was like a completely dreary week. And then I suddenly had to leave, and I was in the bathroom just behind me, and I dropped this big jar of something on the floor and shattered, and the stuff went everywhere. And the first thought that came to my mind was, "You were really a klutz, but I love you." And I thought, look at that. You could have given me anything in the course of that week, and I could not have honestly said something was happening, but something was happening. So I use that teaching story a lot because the practice is not about a particular emotion coming up. It's about a kind of steady and often invisible until something happens, erosion of certain stories and the building up of a kind of care toward ourselves. But I think you can be very critical of yourself and still have a loving.
Well, that's what you had done, and that's why that anecdote fascinates me. I don't find it, I think, so easy to separate the two.
Yeah.
So to separate self-criticism from being mad at yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think they can be different in the way, there's a difference between, I recognize I will never sing for the Metropolitan Opera, no doubt, no matter how much deeper you do anything you want to do. And yet, that's different from the kind of a more wholesale degradation.
I guess in a way, it's a broader challenge, right? I mean, you want to be able to be critical of things other people do if you think they weren't the wise thing to do or the right thing to do, but you don't want to. Well, it's not quite hate the sin, but not the sinner, as they say in Christianity, but it's kind of that, right?
Yeah, it is kind of that. I think a lot of life warrants some criticism. It certainly warrants discernment, like, don't go there again. That was really a big mistake. That was so painful. Look at the pain you caused. Look at the pain you caused yourself as well as others. It's like, that's important to realize. Or, looking at others and thinking, I'm not supporting that. I'm not going there. But that is different than that kind of basic sense of connection, that our lives have something to do with one another, that everybody matters. Even if we don't like everybody, everybody matters.
Right. So one thing that a question that arose as I was thinking about this is, does loving yourself involve loving everything in you? Because, I mean, just regular mindfulness meditation involves examining kind of everything in you. All the feelings, including some feelings you would rather not have, like hatred. And yet, sometimes hating the hatred or hating yourself for the hatred doesn't work and is counterproductive. So, like, what is if you're doing, and I don't think this would be loving kindness, this would be like regular mindfulness meditation, I guess, and somebody comes up and you hate, and and we should say to people who have never done intensive meditation, you really get much better at just observing feelings, like where they are in your body, what their structure is, and really focusing on them, which, can cultivate something like a little bit of, in some sense, detachment. I mean, you're observing them. It's not to say you're not feeling them, but you're not blindly obeying them.
That's right.
And so what is the proper... Is it almost like you need to have a loving attitude toward your hatred to liberate yourself from it? Or what is the appropriate attitude toward hatred?
Yeah, I think it is kind of a loving attitude, but that is a very precise use of the word love. It doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean you're going to support it, that you think, let me cultivate this. It's brought me so much joy. It's not like that at all. I mean, you really see it for what it is, and but also not as we're taught. I mean, one of the things we do sometimes is we try to have a mental translation, like all these states we call bad and wrong and terrible, like our anger, our fear, or greed. We experiment and say, what's it like when we call them states of suffering? Because they are that. They're very painful states. And then we have a different relationship to them. Still don't want to pursue it, but you're not necessarily so ashamed of it and so frightened by it and so condemning of yourself for it. It's saying, oh, yeah, this hurts. This is a painful state. And you can have some compassion for yourself in the face of that state, which I believe is a more effective way to not have that state take over, which is what we want. We really want that gap between, as you just said it, a few minutes ago, between what we're feeling and how we're acting. So maybe that rage, that hatred can be like a storm passing through, and then we decide what we're going to say.
Right.
If we're going to send that email, how we're going to act. It's not that we want to be passive and never take action or be forceful or determined or anything, but is that exactly suited to getting what we want? That email, maybe not. And so we have a chance to make a choice.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about your relationship to yourself. Let's talk about some other kinds of relationships, some of which we've touched on a little, but why don't we go through some categories of relationship, and you can just say anything you want about maybe common issues that arise with people. And let's start with romantic love. Talk about romantic love, its perils and its whatevers.
Well, I think it's obviously it's extremely powerful, and it's something that we really want. And I think it exists in and of itself in that, people would say things to me in these groups like, I really want to be loving toward everybody, but I kind of like my husband better. Do I have to love everybody the way I love my husband? I don't think one does. I think we have special relationships with others. We come together in a certain way. But clearly there's so many myths and there's so many lies and there's so much tension that happens from the idealization of that particular relationship. And there's some astonishing statistic, like of how many people report being lonely in the U.S. It's like 70% or something. And not all of them are alone, Right. Like many of them are in relationships.
Yeah. And do you have a conception of like a really healthy kind of, and when I say romantic love, I don't mean those first few weeks of intense. I just mean, relationship between, the category.
The category.
Do you have a kind of conception of like what the wholesome version of the love is?
I do. I mean, it has two aspects to it that come immediately to mind. Obviously, it has many. One is a story that a man told me, and also very, very early on in my working on this book, where he said something like, in his marriage, he felt like coming to a more liberated kind of love and a state of real love meant for him to move away from kind of the center of the universe, like the seat of privilege, and not only have his wishes met. Sometimes his wife would want something that he would think, well, that doesn't really suit me, but she really wants it.
Mm-hmm.
And he felt that kind of generosity was his movement toward a more real love. And I would say to him, there are lots of people in this world, maybe predominantly women, who never say what they want. And so for them, the movement toward a more real love is going to be different. It's like the presentation of their authentic selves. It's not just giving in and giving over, And I tell his story paired with the story of a friend of mine who was a woman who outlived her cancer prognosis by, I think, 40 years, something like that. And she told me the story about when she was first diagnosed, and she sort of set out on a healing journey on all levels, and some of that emotional and quite a lot to do with her relationship, her marriage. And she said, I used to be the kind of woman who would be sitting in the car with my husband, and I'd be boiling hot, and the most I could bring myself to say was, "Are you warm, dear?" And she said, I had to learn to say, I'm trying to be vicious about it, but I'm really hot. What about you? Can we do something about this?
Yeah.
And that was her healing journey, part of her healing journey, and a good part of her movement toward authentic love, So I tell those stories in the book in juxtaposition with one another. There's something about authenticity and also generosity. There's something about having our voice and being able to say what we want, and also being able to truly listen. Not listen from the center of the universe as though we're about to bestow a kindness, but it's understanding that it's sort of like on the level of all beings. It's reflected in this story when I was driving in a car with a friend of mine once, and we were stuck in traffic, and it was hideous, and we were complaining, and then my friend said, well, we're the traffic too, like we're all in the traffic, we're all
Right.
in this together. So that's part of it. And part of it is reflected in another story in the book where I was visiting an acquaintance, really not like a friend, but an acquaintance, and her young daughter was maybe 21, 22, was sitting in the living room sobbing, and she had just had a fight with her fiance. They'd gone to a restaurant, and she asked the waiter if they could prepare something, not something, unbelievably complicated or something actually quite simple, but not on the menu for her. And her fiance just lit into her and began criticizing her. And you're such a princess, you're so pampered and whatever. And she was weeping in the living room saying, I think I have to end the engagement. And I thought that was pretty mature of her. And there was another person I didn't know really well in the living room, and who was a psychologist, and she said, and long married and happily married, and she said, I'm going to give you one word for a successful relationship. That's mutuality. And mutuality doesn't mean like a checks and balances, like, I gave you 3, you have to give me 4. It's not like that, but it's...
Right. I mean, the giving can be along different dimensions, right? I mean, one person gives along one dimension, the other along another dimension.
Yeah.
But there has to be some kind of like balance of, I don't know if power is the word, but some kind of aggregate symmetry.
Yeah.
So, and what about friends? Now, I've noticed that if you like read people's correspondences from like 150 years ago, overt expressions of love among platonic friends were more common, right?
Yeah.
So, should we have more of those? And in any event, what do you want to say about like love and friendship?
I think that's a wonderful notion. I think we should start that movement.
Okay.
I think that's great because there is such a sense of aloneness in this society, and so many of the ways we used to come together are not necessarily such vital institutions anymore. Even this, I quote the book Bowling Alone, about the diminishing of bowling leagues and things like that. And I think we do need to bolster and kind of amplify the force of that, because friendship is such a tremendous asset in one's life, and the sense of community. Um, it's enormous to be able to have that.
Um, it can be complicated. I mean,
It's always complicated.
there is the word frenemies for a reason.
It's always complicated. I have an online community, Sangha as we call it in Pali, like a meditation community. And it started with a friend of mine said that if he wakes up in the morning and he turns right, he's at his desk and his computer, and if he turns left, he's at his sitting cushion. So 5 of us, including him, formed this online support. It's basically a support community for him to begin with. And so every day when we've meditated, we send an email to the other 4, and the subject line is always turned left. And then if you want, you say turned left, in California it's raining, or you don't have to say anything, but the subject line is what's really important. And because it's like because it's human beings, it involves relationship, which means complexity. So I've had a daily sitting practice for years, and for a long time I was always the first one to write. And then I got really paranoid. I thought, oh no, they think I'm showing off. They think I'm a goody-goody. So I would wait like 7 hours to write, turned left. I think everything brings up everything, but that's part of the beauty, again, of mindfulness, is that you have the ability to deal with what's coming up.
Okay. Now, other kinds of relationships. We talked a little about parents and offspring. Is there anything else you want to say about what kinds of issues arise when people talk to you about this, and what kinds of guidance you give?
Oh, well, it's huge, obviously. It's the most unusual kind of relationship, in that we do have this responsibility at first, which is so enormous. And then this little being, like gets more and more independent. And people really brought up, some very anguished stories about their children, and also in the first group that I did, a woman who was really struggling with her son's drug habit and not knowing what to do, and she said, I think the title of your book should be "Real Love, Simple but Not Easy." It's not easy, and yet here's another place for community. As people help one another and really come together in a kind of affinity, then we don't have to feel so alone with whatever dilemmas. And then, of course, there's the great joy and the incredible delight in this like human being, like coming up and being themselves. And it's a really extraordinary relationship.
Oh, yeah. It's intense. It's intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, but you're also an advocate of love in, just everyday encounters, right? I mean, the clerk at the store, the guy at the gas station. How does that's, it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
But it seems unobjectionable. I mean, so far, what kind of, do you have tips for like how to cultivate this?
Yeah, that isn't the place for the fulsome declaration publicly of the state of love in your heart.
Right. Now, you're probably better off keeping that one quiet until you know them a little better. But still, what can you do to at least feel that?
Well, that's all about attention. It's all about awareness. I also tell a story in the book about a writer friend of mine who, at one point, I was staying in a certain neighborhood in New York City, and so was he, and he wrote about going into a certain store very often and realizing one day that it was pretty much always the same woman working behind the counter, and he barely noticed her. And to a shocking degree to him, that he said, for all I recognized this was a living, breathing human being, she might as well have been a cash register with arms.
Right.
And so he decided to go into the store and pay absolute, complete attention to her. And the first thing he noticed was that she was singing along to something on the radio, and that she had an exquisitely beautiful voice. And he said, wow, you have a beautiful voice. And she just lit up, and she gave him this big, radiant smile. So I was reading that, and I thought, wow, I go into the same store a lot, too. And I know who he's talking about, and I hardly noticed her either. And so I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to say, I heard you have a really beautiful voice, and I'm going to watch her, like, light up. And I walked in the store, and the first thing I noticed was that she was already smiling radiantly. And I realized, oh, I have no idea who this woman is. She was like an object to me as well. And that because of that lack of awareness, there's no possibility of connection, that true connection. You may not know their name. You may not learn their trials and tribulations. You certainly may not want to bring them home with you. That's a different thing. But that moment of simply being there, two people, full on, is, a lot of researchers are calling that love now, because of the biochemical effect of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in a way it's surprisingly easy to feel affection for people you don't normally notice. And here's why I think it is. Okay, so I think if you pay attention to your everyday awareness, or just watch the way other people focus their awareness, you'll notice that there's certain kinds of people they tend to notice, and it depends on their demographic, right? Like you're a young heterosexual woman, say, well then you're going to be paying more attention to young men than old women as you walk down the street. And the people you pay attention to, because they're in that category, you're going to be evaluating. You're going to be attractive, unattractive, jerk, not a jerk. You're going to be making all these judgments. And the people you're not noticing, the fact that you're not noticing them also means that if you did notice them, you wouldn't really be inclined to be that judgmental, because they don't. Right. They're not in the demographic that figures very centrally in your life. Right, right. Yeah. Or a potential ally or enemy, I mean, the way young males might size up other young males is is he going to be on my team, or and so the challenge really is just kind of paying attention, because once you pay attention, unless the person happens to do something obnoxious while you're paying attention, I think the actual sympathy follows pretty easily. But the challenge is paying attention. Yeah,
the challenge is definitely paying attention, and that's why one of the great controversies about a state like loving kindness or compassion is, can it be trained? I mean, that sounds so cold and mechanistic, but we believe it can be trained because it's an emergent property of how you pay attention. And we know attention can be trained. That's exactly what meditation is training attention.
Okay, so we've talked about romantic relationships, familial relationships, and just kind of casual relationships in the sense of just people you don't know very well but you see. So let's spend a little more time on actual people you hate.
Let's.
Either enemies, either personal enemies, or kind of seemingly loathsome characters that you see on TV. First of all, you're advocating, I gather, trying to cultivate love for all of them.
I'm saying we have the potential for love for all of them, and I would be so happy if love figured somewhere in the conversation. Which doesn't mean being inert, and doesn't mean liking somebody. It certainly doesn't mean approving of them. But and it also is a question of timing. I mean, if somebody has just directly harmed you or those you care about, maybe it's loving kindness for yourself that's more an issue right then. But, I think about one of the strongest images in my mind is people who were, in the civil rights movement, the freedom riders going out to register people to vote in the South. And they'd start out in front of those buses, and they'd crouch down and they'd pray. And then they'd go forward and they'd be beaten up. And, in those documentaries, I saw one guy badly beaten up in the hospital, and somebody went to visit him, was interviewing him, and he was like, he himself was radiant. He said, "We're practicing nonviolence." And I think, where does that courage come from? Where does that ability to do that come from? It didn't seem to come from, let's hate on, It came from connecting to something bigger, and it had to do with love. Loving your enemies, and loving yourself, realizing I am worth something, I'm not going to just stand back and take it, and this other person's worth something. They have the right to vote. And, so we have seen this. We have seen that kind of strength of love, or love being part of the conversation. But we confuse it with weakness. We confuse it with giving in. And it seems ludicrous. I mean, when the Buddha taught loving kindness meditation, they say, he taught it as the antidote to fear. And that makes sense to us, right? If you're thinking about this difficult person, this enemy, you don't want your choices in your relationship governed by fear. So having something else in place, a different kind of connection. if you think of love as giving in, as acquiescing, as liking, as supporting, it makes no sense. And I mean, it would be ludicrous to do that.
Okay. So ultimately, I mean, as we continue along the spectrum, there's a sense in which, I mean, so we've gone all the way to enemies, but there's a sense in which you go beyond that. I mean, it at some point becomes a love of, how would you put it, a love of everything, or a love of connection itself, or kind of all these things, right? It's an attitude toward reality almost.
Yeah. Yeah. So what if, the example I used earlier of like we're all the traffic? What if that became we're all life? We're all part of life. And instead of like I'm the bystander, I'm the observer, like, we're in the midst of this whole uproarious, existence. And again, it's not like saying I'm pleased by everything that's happening in my life, or I'm liking everything, but it's really that sense of connection. Like, here we are. And I feel like when I was growing up and I was studying science in junior high school or whatever, that wasn't really the mode, that we were taught. It was a much kind of more sophisticated later development, almost of like, we live in an interconnected universe. Like, you never used to hear that word in media, in TV or anything like that. We live in an interconnected universe, that this isn't fanciful, this isn't sentimental, this isn't even nice always, It's just the way that it is. Okay, so how do we respond? How do we get rid of some of this sense of division and self and other and us and them and so on, to reflect a greater, it's just how things are.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's all worth cultivating, I think. And, it's very challenging. It's not easy to love people you hate.
It's not easy to love people you hate.
That's why they call it hate.
That's a good book title. I'd suggest that.
Yeah. Well, you actually had a book, and we talked about this on this very show, your book, Love Your Enemies.
That's right.
Which you co-authored with Bob Thurin. So here is the book, or at least this is the title page, Real Love, The Art of Mindful Connection by Sharon Salzberg. It's brand new because we're taping this shortly before publication, and we will post this during the first week of publication. Available at Amazon and all kinds of other places, including your local independent bookstore. And thanks so much, Sharon, for taking the time.
Thank you. It was wonderful to see you.
And I hope this won't be the last time we do this.
That's great.
Okay. Bye-bye.